Welcome, everybody. This is Buck Joffrey with the Wealth Formula Podcast. Man, it is hot here in Santa Barbara. It feels hot at least. I mean, it's probably only in the 80s, so I shouldn't be complaining too much because I know those of you who are in Arizona are in the hundreds. But we don't get this kind of hot weather, so we're not used to it here. So we start complaining very easily. And anyway, that's the deal. So I am here doing this thing here, sweating in my t-shirt, and going to bring you a very interesting podcast today. But before we get into that, I just wanted to remind you, you can download my book, 7 Secrets of Eternal Wealth, at wealthformula.com, or you can simply text me at 44222 and type wealth formula, one word, and you can get that delivered to your cellular phone, I guess, basically to your email. You'll see how it works, but it's a cool way to get it. And the other thing I want to mention, because I haven't mentioned in a couple of days, and I just think there's so many of you that would benefit from being part of this Wealth Formula Network community, which is the private group, the private forum, and the private mastermind calls that we have every other week. And then on top of that, the course that creates sort of the basis of everything, the sort of the curriculum that you have as the baseline to get you caught up, that all can be found at wealthformularoadmap.com. And I think it's a really great opportunity for those of you who are, just starting to get interested in this stuff, really try to find a community, a tribe with which you can communicate and with whom you can ask questions and invest. We have these cool bi-weekly mastermind calls. Anyway, think about it. It's really dirt cheap. Go to wealthformularoadmap.com and check that out. Now, the title of this podcast is Why Wax is Hot. And so, of course, that is referring to Worldwide Asset Exchange, or WAX token. So I was being kind of cutesy there, but it makes me remember this whole thing that we're going to talk about today makes me go back to the days of when I was a kid in the back of my parents' car on long driving trips to Wisconsin. You see, we used to go to this place called Wisconsin Dells. And for those of you in the Midwest, you probably know what that is. It's kind of like Las Vegas for children. Lots of water parks, go-karts, stuff like that. We used to eat at this place called Paul Bunyan, which was like this place where, it was a bunch of big Paul Bunyan statue outside, and it looked like it was like an old-fashioned place, and, you had tin plates and all that kind of stuff. And we'd stay in these, cheap hotels while we were there, because my dad was always into the cheap hotel. We never stayed anywhere fancy. And we always stayed somewhere with those outside swimming pools outside. They're probably pretty gross in retrospect. But anyway, we used to go there and stay there. And you know what? My brother, sister, and me would have a great time. It was good stuff for kids. The only thing I didn't like personally about going on those trips was the drive. It took 3 to 4 hours to get there from my home. Of course, I lived in the Twin Cities in Minnesota. And you see, back then, we didn't have iPads, of course, which we could watch movies on. We didn't even have iPods, right? We didn't have anything to really entertain ourselves except one another. We pretty much had one another and the view of pretty much nondescript flat farmland that made up most of the view on that car ride. Now, these days I look at my kids and their life is so different, right? I mean, we take them out, my wife and I, we take them out to restaurants all the time. We don't leave them behind. We like having them around. And usually these days, it's only the 3-year-old that really gives us much trouble because, of course, she's 3 and she's very demanding. And when she gets a little bit out of control and we try to keep her quiet because we're bothering everyone around us, all I do is I flip out my iPhone. I find Peppa Pig on YouTube, and that pretty much pacifies her for the rest of the evening. Now, for those of you who are old enough to remember life before the internet and smartphones, just step back, step back for a moment and compare your childhood reality to those of your children. By the way, you got to wonder how our parents managed us when we were kids like that, right? They didn't have any, phones to just put on a video or something like that. Anyway, your children know no reality. They don't know a reality without the internet. They may not be able to talk on the phone as well as we did. I mean, my kids, like when they're trying to talk on the phone, my oldest one's 9. I have a 9-year-old, 5-year-old, and 3-year-old. Of course, none of them really know how to use a phone because we don't give them cell phones. And then there was a demise of landlines, so they don't even know what they're doing. They get on the phones and they just kind of look at it and they're like, "Hi," and that's it. They just kind of sit there. They don't know what to do with the phone, but they do know how to text. Because my 9-year-old will text her cousin on my sister's phone. They know how to email because that's always been part of their reality. So, in considering this change, we have to understand that our entire sense of reality is actually a bit different than the younger generations. I remember hearing Randy Zuckerberg talk at an event I was at, Mark Zuckerberg's sister, and she was saying that her son, who was, I think he was like 2 or 3 years old at the time, thought that his grandfather lived in a computer for the first few years of his life because he primarily saw him on Skype on the family computer there. So that's the way, our realities are shaped, is what we see and what our brains kind of create around that. And of course, our lives are becoming increasingly connected with the internet, and the line between what is real and what is not real is actually blurred. It's not really the same anymore. You've probably heard of people, for example, buying things, virtual items, they call them online, things like CryptoKitties, for example, paying like literally like, 6 figures in US dollars, for example, for unique online only items. Now, if you're like me, you're thinking, why in the world would you buy something like that? Something that just exists on the internet. Well, what if you spent several hours per day on the internet? Is your cyber bling, so to speak, any less important than the ones we consider real? It makes me think, I have this picture in my office of this vintage Ferrari. It's like a 1960, I don't know what kind it is. It's like some super cool looking old Ferrari convertible. And I'm sure it's like, a big waste of money for me. But it is like something that, I think someday, I should just try to buy one of those because I think it's so cool. Every time I see one, I get super excited. And it's not like I really see them very often, but mostly in magazines or whatever. And one day I would like to have one. I'd like to have one in real life because that picture doesn't really, of course, mean anything. But, the generations that are coming up don't see the difference between owning that real Ferrari that I'm talking about and owning something unique, even if that unique thing only exists in this fourth dimension that we call, the internet, or it's this cyber reality. Now, if you spend most of your downtime there in that world, that's probably where you want your version of that vintage Ferrari to be, right? I mean, after all, you're spending all your time there. Why would you want your bling to be in the real world? So I know this sounds like science fiction, and maybe it's, maybe you think this is a bit much. I mean, I don't know if we're going there. Well, I disagree, because remember, this is a changing world. Just a few decades back, I mean, listen, remember we were kids, we were watching the Jetsons. Remember that Here's George Jetson, that show, futuristic show? Remember, one of the things that they had on there all the time was they had the futuristic video phone call where they were like looking at people in the phone while they were talking to them. It doesn't seem so futuristic anymore, does it? A new generation is on the rise, and their perception of reality is different than ours. And if you start to understand this, you'll see very quickly an entire world that's unfolding before your very eyes. And some of this is being aided by the rise of distributed ledger technology. I know you've heard about it a fair number of times in this show, but it's really interesting stuff. Now, one of these projects that I'm really excited about is from the standpoint of as an investor, is a project by Worldwide Asset Exchange, otherwise known as WAX. When these kinds of seismic changes occur in the technological world, there's also money to be made, right? So don't be blind to it. I mean, look at it as an opportunity. Now, Wax is a project that I am convinced will become a major player in what is now already a $50 billion industry that we're going to talk about. In other words, I think holders of Wax token, which is the way you would invest in this project right now, have a very good chance of doing quite well over the next few years if they get in early. And to help you understand why I'm so enthusiastic about this project, this week on Wealth Formula Podcast, I've invited the president of Wax, Malcolm CasSelle, to explain the strange and brave new world which involves the gaming industry. And he will explain all about it. It's going to kind of probably blow your mind if this is new to you. And I think you'll find it very interesting. So when we come back, Malcolm CasSelle of Wax Token. Welcome back to the show, everyone. Today, my guest on Wealth Formula Podcast is Malcolm CasSelle. Malcolm, he's an entrepreneur, and he's the CIO of Opskins, which we'll get into, and the president of Worldwide Asset Exchange, or WAX. Prior to his current position, he served in numerous roles internationally as an entrepreneur. He's held multiple C-level positions in startups and highly successful companies in the technology space. And he's also been an active early-stage investor in companies like Facebook, Zynga, and most recently, Bitcoin-related companies, which will be appropriate to what we're talking about today. Malcolm, welcome to Wealth Formula Podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me, Buck.
So this is going to be sort of, unusual and different for the audience. So we certainly have had people in the cryptocurrency space. We have had Tika Tiwari. We've had Mance Harmon from Hashgraph. And so what I wanted to do a little bit is sort of back up and talk about Opskins and what that is and how you got involved, and then kind of ease into that and then discussing some of the challenges with that business and go into kind of what you guys are doing right now. So why don't you get started just telling us a little bit? I mean, you're obviously a guy who's been in the tech space for a while. You're an MIT, Stanford guy. You got tech written all over you. How'd you get into the ops? What is Opskins, and how did you get into it?
Sure. So Opskins is the largest marketplace in the world for people who want to buy and sell virtual items from video games. So for those of you who are not video game players, just to give some context, the video game industry is about $130 billion industry, so 13 times bigger than the film industry. Okay, so it's huge. And about 80% of the revenue generated in the video game industry is selling virtual items. So when people acquire those items, they have some value, some residual value. Sometimes that value increases over time, like any collectible would. And they want to buy and sell them. And we are the Amazon of that ecosystem. So when people want to buy and sell those items for cash, they come to us and they use Opskins. So that's what we do. My background really started in commerce and online businesses, starting back in the first .com. I got involved in the video game ecosystem in 2011, and I worked on a project called Xfire, which was a social platform for hardcore video gamers, similar to the audience we have today. These are the PC gamers. They are the ones who spend a lot on these rigs. They have like really expensive monitors and chairs and headphones, kind of like the kind you have. They're not just your casual mobile gamer. These are the ones who are really, really passionate about it. And so I started working with some of the team members here. At that time, I also got involved in crypto. So I started investing in crypto businesses back in 2011, 2012, 2013. And so I started really seeing how this ecosystem was evolving. Right. And it was clear, even years ago, that a peer-to-peer decentralized platform was going to win over a centralized one. And
Before we get into that, though,
we can explain that.
I want to back up a little bit, because one of the things I think keys to understanding why this is such a big deal potentially for investors to look at as a space is understanding this world that I think is foreign to most of us 40-something professional guys, which is the idea that their virtual items have a real value to them. Give us some examples of that. And because I think a lot of people, and of course I know a little bit about it, but give us some examples that show that people really believe that these things that they're buying on the internet have great value and that they're willing to pay a lot of money for them.
Yeah, so earlier this year, we sold a skin. And just to clarify, a skin is a virtual item that has no function. It just changes the look. So we call them cosmetic. And so imagine, if you had a Snapchat filter, right? And maybe if your listeners are familiar, and use the Snapchat filter, it changes your face, right? And that's called a skin, or changes the environment. Right, put sparkles in it or rainbows and so forth. So that's called a cosmetic item. It doesn't change your voice. Well, it could, but in most cases, it doesn't change your voice. Doesn't change the content other than the look. And so, cosmetic items are what we specialize in. And we sold a cosmetic item for $61,000 recently.
So all that does, in effect, is it might be the way a player character looks on the screen. So
yeah, and so
reality than most of us live in.
Yeah. I mean, if you have an avatar in an environment, and you want the avatar to look a certain way, well, then of course, you would buy a skin, right, for that avatar.
Right. So, and the reason I emphasize that so much is to get your arms around this. You have to understand, I think, that this generation, particularly that is growing up in this gaming world, the line between virtual and real is not the same line that we think of. Like a lot of us 40-something, professionals, et cetera.
Yeah. So let me just speak to your point. The line between real and virtual, and why that's so important today. So think of it this way. Today, the youth are spending the majority of their time looking at a screen. And on that screen is their identity. It's their social profile, it's their avatar, it's the character they have in a game. And so for that character to be elevated or diminished, it's like the world to them. Okay, It's just like, we talk about cyberbullying. And so if somebody posts something negative on your profile, kids will have really, really a tough time. It turns out if you sit back and you really think about it, and you say, well, actually, it has nothing to do with them. It has to do with their identity inside of a virtual environment, which they call a Facebook page.
Right.
Okay. So the reality is that most of us have already made that leap where we actually attach our identity to the thing we have online, our Facebook page online. So if somebody says something about it or comments on it, we take it personally. Okay, so now if you're spending all of your time looking at a screen, you're spending a lot of your time in a virtual environment, whatever happens or occurs for that identity in that virtual environment feels very personal. Right. So this is the brain chemicals. This is oxytocin. This is endorphins. This is serotonin. So you feel excited when good things happen. You feel really happy when it's welcomed, when your identity is welcomed. You feel very maybe demoralized when you lose a competition, or people's are saying things, he's not very good at, or he lost and so forth. So people take it very personally. And so these identities are very important to them. And so they will spend whatever resources they have at their disposal to elevate those identities, to feel better. Just like if you live on the Upper East Side in Manhattan and you carry a $40,000 Birkin bag or a $40,000 diamond ring, neither of which have real value at that level. They don't do anything. A bag just, you could use a shopping bag, or the ring. You don't even need the ring. It doesn't do anything. Yet you'll spend massive amounts of money for those things because it affects your identity, affects how you feel, affects your relationships, your peer group, etc. That's exactly what's happening in a virtual environment. And that transition has already started to occur for the vast majority of us who have even a Facebook profile, let alone play video games.
So these skins that you're talking about, virtual items, or I think you can also put in some of these things. People know a little bit about crypto kitties. They've heard of things like that. They are unique. items, right? There's something about them making you just can't like photocopy them and, and scan them back in. They're truly unique items, and that's what gives them a certain value. And how do you make sure those things are unique? How do these people do that?
So traditionally, the uniqueness of an item comes from, let's say, the collective belief by a group. So let's say you and I are collecting baseball cards, and you come across a Babe Ruth that's like vintage or mint condition, right? Yeah. We believe, because we've been trading baseball cards, we know about baseball cards for a long time, that item is very rare, and hence the value is high, okay? In the virtual environment, the uniqueness has traditionally been determined by the game company. The game company says, okay, we have this many items and we're issuing only so many of this particular item, and we deem that this particular item is highly sought after. Now, just because something's rare doesn't mean that it's valuable. It also has to be desirable, right? So you need rarity and you need desirability. When those two things come together, that's when you get something collectible and worth a whole lot, right?
Right.
So this is the same thing as if it was like Star Wars collectibles that we were, holding on to from the 80s, right? Same thing in terms of rarity and desirability. There may only be like a couple of Chewbacca's, but if nobody wants it, or Jar Jar Binks, nobody wants it, so nobody's gonna, nobody cares. So
now we have this. Now that I think that's an important place to continue this conversation where Opskins fits in. Because now we know that, okay, well, listen, virtual items to people in this world have the same value as, me buying a car that I covet, something like that. So where do you buy them from each other? And that's where Opskins comes in, and effectively it's a trading platform. And then inherently,
well, let's make a distinction. Trading and a marketplace are different.
Right.
So trading is, hey, we're going to swap something back and forth, and that could be cashless, right? I could gift something to you. So we offer trading, and it is a free offering. But then we also have a marketplace where you can sell it for cash. And that's a very different thing. When you can sell it for US dollars or euros, you can cash out. That's pretty exciting, right? You have something of value, and I can exchange it for money that I can use for anything else.
And you have a global marketplace where, you have somebody in Russia who is trying to sell something to somebody in Korea. And that's where there's a pain point with the currencies, et cetera. How has that been up to now, up to the point of cryptocurrency? How has that been addressed? And if you could talk a little bit about the potential inefficiencies that you guys have seen in that area.
Sure. So when two people are trading who don't know each other, which is the case 99% of the time, there's no trust, right? So you have this Mexican standoff. You have an item I want, I'm willing to pay for it. Who does what first? If I give it to you, you could run off with the money. If you give me the item, I could run off with the item and you don't get paid. So you need an intermediary. Okay, so that's the first thing. The second thing is that, items could be stolen, items could be, fake or something. I can talk about sort of fake. Fake is not a huge issue because the game company is determined, how those things get authenticated. And we've moved that to the blockchain, but we act as the authenticator in the middle just to make sure we double check everything. So if you get an offer, it's a real offer. And then the third thing is that, that currency that's used is really important. So let's say we're trading an item that's 50 cents. Good luck taking an item that's 50 cents and transferring it from Korea to Russia. I mean, by the time you do all the currency conversion and back and forth, let's say it's priced in dollars, that means you got to convert from Korean dollars, Korean won to US dollars, back to ruble. There's going to be nothing left. So that means that there's no way to transfer something worth 50 cents between these two borders. So that's why you need an intermediary, and that's where crypto plays a role. It means that I can come into the platform, I can trade back and forth instantaneously, I can trade back and forth without those currency conversion costs, and of course, it becomes possible to do items that are 2 cents or $2,000.
Right. So before crypto, there is just sort of this inefficient broker system, right? Can you talk about kind of how that was done Because
Yeah,
it's
well, that's how Opskins. Yeah, that's how Opskins became so successful. We were the first ones to kind of solve that problem. We were using U.S. dollars as a standard, but we allowed people to upload money from their local currency, and then we allowed them to cash out in their local currency. But they would do that after they had conducted many, many transactions. So the fee would say be amortized across a lot of transactions, and it was reasonable, right? If you're trying to do it item by item, it's not even possible.
right.
But what we had done is we built a centralized system. So that means everyone had to come to Opskins to make it work. Now, inherently, that limits the growth of the business because, people they hang out watching a particular streamer or they're hanging out watching a particular blog. To force them to come to our site to either list their inventory for sale or to buy inventory is just not the way people are used to doing things. People like to be able to buy right where they're consuming things in the way that they're doing it. So if you think about on Facebook, what happens? You can now, do so many things within Facebook that you couldn't do before. You can message right from within Facebook, right?
Right.
And before you'd go to a different program to do that, right? But now people expect it to be embedded into it. So what Wax is simply the ability to do commerce wherever gamers are consuming their gaming content.
Right. So let's just back up real quick. So Wax is it's Worldwide Asset Exchange.
Yes.
And it's a cryptocurrency, right? And
it's more than that. I mean, it's really a blockchain.
Right. Why don't you talk sort of back up on that, because I know there's actually multiple implementations of this. But so you guys decided, instead of saying, well, hey, why don't we just have a marketplace with, Bitcoin or Ethereum or whatever, and just use cryptocurrencies to actually create another token. And tell me why you decided to do that. And I think you were alluding it to a little bit, people having their own stores and that sort of thing. But talk about the evolution of where Wax token comes in, and in the context of other cryptocurrencies, and the larger vision of what you were thinking about in terms of this project.
Sure. Well, I think first we all have to admit that Bitcoin has failed as a payment method, and so has Ethereum. We understand they're too expensive, they're slow, and the fees are variable. So several weeks ago, the fees for transacting in Ethereum went from 50 cents to $50, and nobody noticed. We did, right? Because if you're running a real business, you'd be screaming if suddenly your toll went from 50 cents to $50 driving to work, right? People would get out of their cars and riot. Right? Yet nobody did that several weeks ago. Why is that? Because nobody's using Ethereum for anything truly commercial. Nobody cares, because these are still experiments in a kitchen somewhere.
Sure.
Okay? So my point is simply that as running a real business, it was clear to us, if we don't have our own blockchain, right, to enable these kinds of transactions that we can control and keep those costs low and make the transactions really fast, there was no hope of creating a truly enterprise-based business. And what we've been doing is essentially building a peer-to-peer trading mechanism. So in other words, rather than having to come to Opskins, Wax allows you, say you and I, to trade between the two of us with just this piece of software running in the middle. So when I say decentralized, it really means that people can trade between each other rather than having to go to a centralized authority. And that's the magic of it. Now, it's a token as well, because the token is how you actually pay to do the transactions on that chain. And that's, I think people probably understand that if they have any familiarity with blockchain, that a token is often used to power the platform itself. And so our chain is in alpha. We're already running. We've launched a distributed application called a DApp and a collectible. And that collectible is called VGO. And that DApp has become the most transacted DApp in the world virtually overnight. It's way bigger than all the other collectibles like crypto.
Back up and tell us about that, because that's probably going to be, I mean, I think that's an incredibly impressive thing and something that's really important for people to understand. First of all, tell us a little bit more about Vigo, what it is, what people are doing, and how how it's making money.
Yeah. So think about collectibles, like we were talking about, like CryptoKitties. For those who are not familiar, was really just think of them like playing cards, and each one's unique. Were thousands and thousands of them, and it has a cat on it, and a cat with particular characteristics. Maybe it has a mustache, maybe it runs fast, maybe it's tall, maybe it's short, etc. And people started to collect these items. That was mostly speculators. It wasn't a pre-existing ecosystem of people who cared about CryptoKitties. When we launched in a partnership with this collectible called Vigo, it was targeted specifically to a market of people who really like CS:GO. CS:GO is a very popular game called Counter-Strike Global Offensive. It's got a global audience. It's been one of our biggest traded items on Opskins for a long time. And so what they decided to do in support of what I think is also our vision was this idea of an item-centric world. When we say item-centric, most game publishers think, or app developers think everything revolves around the app. And an item-centric view is everything revolves around the user and the ownership of their item. So if you acquire an item, we believe you should own it. It would be like, let's say you bought a car, right? You bought a BMW, and BMW said, sorry, you can't sell that car to anyone else. Or you can only drive it on Tuesdays, you can't drive it on Wednesdays. I mean, they would be absurd, right?
Yeah, right.
So that's why, the game developers are sort of disconnected from the way consumers typically think of things. They've been placing restrictions upon users' ability to do things with the virtual items that they pay for or they earn in the games. And so we believe in a world where there are no restrictions. And that's part of the reason we designed Wax, to enable customers to have the power to trade and do things with them as they wish. And that's why peer-to-peer is so important. When we take ourselves out of the picture as the centralized trader, that means that others can trade and no one can interfere.
Let's talk a little bit about the other side of this, which is, you and I were talking the other day, and you mentioned something I thought was interesting, and I think maybe this audience would resonate with it. We've drawn this line between this world that we're used to, which is the real world, and then we have this virtual world, where there's also an intersection, and where a pizza, an online pizza, could represent a real pizza. Mm-hmm. And so having that ability to exchange those types of things online in a peer-to-peer fashion too. Could you talk a little bit about that? Because I think that's pretty interesting it sounds like it's sort of maybe phase 2 in terms of what you guys are doing, but which is a really interesting and exciting kind of way to look at the world as technology continues.
Yeah, I think it is really interesting because right now, when you buy something, you sort of have to consume it when you buy it, right? Like if I buy a pizza, I got to get the pizza right now. And what if I could buy a pizza but consume it later, whenever I wanted? Or I could give it to you and you could consume it whenever you wanted.
Right. Like a gift certificate.
Yeah, but it's instantaneously fungible. And a gift certificate's a pain in the butt, right? Moving a gift certificate around, or even a gift card. Yeah. But imagine that I could buy a pizza, right? And I could send it to you instantly. Say, hey, Buck, thanks for what you did, or I really appreciate that. Or we could trade it. I could trade you the pizza for a bouquet of flowers. Yep. Right? And then you can consume that pizza when you want, how you want, or you could give it to your son, right? And your son can go consume it, or you could give it to your neighbor, right? So it would totally change the dynamics of how we think about consumption. In other words, we'd be able to trade the value of something and consume it later. And we would actually uncouple the idea of having to consume it now and owning it. Now, this is, to some, maybe an abstract concept that seems very, very weird. However, think about what human behavior is like. Think about how we love to collect things. Think about how we love to own things. Think about how we love to trade things.
Yeah.
Look in your garage. How many things do you have in there?
Mm-hmm.
Got a lot of stuff probably, right? I know I do.
Right.
So if I said, I'd like to have 10 pizzas just here, just in case, just in case, you never know. Or, I want to have like 14, battery packs that I can consume later. And I can use those anytime I want. They're there. Or I can trade them. this is going to unlock, I think, a completely new industry. And our goal is to be the masters of trading, virtual items that are actually real.
Yeah, and that would be sort of
real items.
Gifting industry is kind of what we're talking about, right?
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about, because I know at least in gifting, I mean, I think there's Gifto. Who are the competitors, if there are any competitors to Wax? Largely what I've seen is so far is synergistic relationships with other distributed ledger projects, but I don't know that I've seen anybody who really is doing anything kind of like you. Is there competition, direct competition?
Well, so there are lots of sites creating virtual items. So that's the first thing. So we created Vigo in partnership with a group that came up with it, and we pushed it, through the Wax ecosystem to demonstrate the power of the Wax ecosystem. And as I mentioned before, it's become the most successful collectible in the world. It's generating hundreds of millions of dollars annually, and it's basically brand new, and it's resting upon this idea of skins. Okay, and it's a fantastic business. But we're not in the item creation business. We're in the marketplace business. And so everyone who's creating an item, we want to be the place where that buying and selling occurs. Okay. Right. So if we view anyone who's tokenizing other assets as compatible with this ecosystem. Now, all the guys who are creating assets may be competing with each other, but for us, it's not about who wins. We just want to be the place where whoever is winning gets to transact. In terms of other people building marketplaces, we see some people talking about building marketplaces, but we haven't seen any that have, already a user base, have the scale, and have the depth of understanding about how this ecosystem works. But there are some folks who are trying to do it in collectibles, crypto collectibles. But I think that crypto collectibles are very much a challenged category because most of them rest upon Ethereum. And as we mentioned earlier, Ethereum is, I think, a failed proposition when it comes to running a commercial business on it.
Right. There was this happened when CryptoKitties, there was like the big problem with the Ethereum network getting completely clogged up and all that. It's just not terribly efficient with that regard. One of the things I think is really neat about this whole project, and why I'm a big holder of Wax token myself, because I really, in many ways, it makes so much sense to me, is that you are also the biggest, this goes back to Opskins. I mean, you are already sort of the market maker already. And what you're doing is you're creating a currency, and making it just easier to transact. The customers are already there. So it's not a theoretical project. I mean, do you feel like, to me, that seems like one of the biggest advantages that you have?
Yeah, I think having millions and millions of customers is a huge advantage. I won't discount that at all.
Yeah, right.
But but also having a brand, right?
Yeah.
We have like a 98% Trustpilot score, so that means it's like a very, very trusted and valued brand. All those things are great and fantastic. But I think the one thing that is the most important out of all of those things is our understanding of how the customers work. I don't know any other group that could launch a collectible and go to hundreds of millions of dollars overnight. It's just, I've never seen anyone do that. And that's one thing that our group is really good at, because we understand how to work with third parties. We have, hundreds and hundreds of third parties coordinated in making that effort a success, and they're all continuing to grow because we are really a B2B play. We understand how to empower other marketplaces or other sellers or other buyers. So if you go on YouTube and you'll see thousands and thousands of videos about the things that we do, because we work with influencers very effectively. The items are designed in a way that the collectors really understand. There's appraisers involved. There's other games that are using those items in their games now. So when you think about coordinating all of these pieces to make it successful, it's something that's, I think, a rare combination, and it comes more from, one of the folks on our team invented item trading. Okay, in 1997, and built the first successful company, became a multi-billion-dollar company. And so our experience in this goes back to literally the core roots of it. And I think that that's really one of our strategic advantages.
What do you think in terms of timeline? Right now, I know you mentioned, as you mentioned, I think you mentioned you're almost there. I mean, we've almost got, there's the token right now, but that's, you're going to launch the new blockchain. People who own the current Wax token are going to get an equivalent amount of that. And then how do you see this like evolve in your eyes? Like how does this sort of catch, it's already caught on, but really start penetrating through that, however big a market you said that, how big is this market? You said it was like.
So item trading is a $50 billion market. This is the secondary market for trading.
Right.
$50 billion.
So $50 billion dollar market in trading. The goal here is presumably to make this really decentral currency, decentral, ledger for all of that.
Yeah.
What is it? How far along are you in that journey? And how do you see this all rolling out?
So I think the way to think about what we're doing is our blockchain is designed to create an open platform. So if you can think back to AOL, remember America Online?
Mm-hmm.
And it was a battle of America Online versus the internet. Okay, if you go back even further, it was a battle between proprietary interactive television networks, right, that Microsoft was trying to support, and the internet. And both gave up. Microsoft gave up and said, you know what? Forget these two-way cable networks, too expensive, it'll take forever to roll out. We're just going to embrace the internet. What did AOL do? They embraced the internet ultimately. So we believe that open wins over closed. The momentum is just over time, just too strong, and it compounds, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So what we're really building is an open platform for items and virtual items. And if you believe virtual items are huge and getting bigger, you say, whoever builds that open platform for virtual items is going to be a huge winner. It's a very, very simple proposition.
If you're an investor, and I know you don't want to talk too much about this, but some people are probably thinking, well, how does Wax, what would make Wax go up in price? If you had a token, is that token supposed to stay constant? Is it supposed to go up? What forces create price changes in that token?
So I can't talk about our own token, and I can't talk about price of our token, but I can talk about token economics in general.
Right.
So I think one of the powerful drivers is you want to have increased demand. So you want an ecosystem that's continually driving greater demand for a token, and then you also want a mechanism that continually reduces supply. Right? So you want increased demand and decreased supply, and you want both of those things happening simultaneously. Now, some token economics I've seen support just one idea, right? Either decreased supply or increased demand. I believe the ideal ones do both.
Right.
So we've designed our ecosystem to address both of those. We talk about it in the white paper. I don't need to get into detail about that, but basically, the more the platform gets used, right, basically the less tokens are available. And the more it gets used, those tokens get taken out of circulation by the folks benefiting from the ecosystem. And so for us, we know how to drive demand. We've grown our platform from zero to a multi-billion-dollar revenue stream. And so we know how to build demand, and we've designed the token economics to continually constrain the supply. And that's basically how we've designed the business.
Got it. So if people want to learn more about, I don't know, just everything here, I think, is it wax.io?
Yeah. If you go to wax.io, you can link to our blog there. We have new postings every week about what we're up to, partnerships, and how the business is evolving. We've launched Wax Express Trade, which has been really successful. We've worked with this collectible I mentioned called Vigo, which has been really successful. We have lots of other things. We even talked about trading in real life items, IRL items like sneakers and things like that, which are coming. So in other words, the way it would work is I would buy a token. That token would represent a particular pair of sneakers sitting in a manufacturer. I could then trade that token, sell that token, or consume that token. right? So let's say I traded it with you and you decide to consume that token. You then use it, and that entitles you to a pair of sneakers from that manufacturer, and it gets sent to you directly.
Right.
So this trading of IRL, of in real life items, is coming. And our blockchain, as I mentioned, is in the alpha. And so it's running all the transactions for Vigo. As I mentioned, it's now the largest tradable item in the world by an order of magnitude. So it's really starting to show the pieces, starting to come into focus. You can start to see the success of collectibles. You can see the success of like the chain, even in its early phase. So Q4 is really when you'll start to see all these pieces come together. Wax Express Trade, the trading platform. You'll see more games that will be announced that are on the platform. You'll see more collectibles. All those things will come together. So I think towards the end of the year, we'll really start, the picture will become clear for a lot of people who, we have fans who've been with us from day one who are observing and watching carefully, but then there's a lot of newcomers who are taking a look, and I think they'll see the whole picture as we get towards the end of the year.
This has been absolutely fascinating. And what we're going to do, too, is at some point, Malcolm and I and another a colleague of ours, we've been talking about having a little bit more in-depth webinar for people who are interested in the project. So we'll announce when we're going to do that. But in the meantime, Malcolm, thanks a ton for being on the show. This has been really great.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Buck. It's been a real pleasure.
We'll be right back. Welcome back to the show, everyone. I hope you found that topic as interesting as I did. This project is super cool, and I'm investing in it personally. And I'm really bullish on it. I just think it's like such a no-brainer with where things are going and what they're doing. But again, that's not investment advice. I'm just sharing with you my enthusiasm for this particular project in the cryptocurrency. Now, even if you're not into cryptocurrency, I'm sure you will agree that it is a fascinating world to watch as it unfolds. But on that note, I do want to be cognizant of the fact that I have been doing a fair amount in this world on this podcast, right? I have been covering a lot of crypto topics, crypto people, and frankly, not everyone is into this whole crypto thing. And I don't want this to become a crypto show per se. I don't want to make it like, okay, yeah, there goes Buck and his crypto thing again. So, on the other hand, it's something that I'm really heavily involved in at this point. Personally, as I mentioned it before, I think on this show, that these days I watch, cryptocurrency. I keep up with crypto news, distributed ledger stuff, white papers, etc., as closely as I do the Minnesota Vikings. Now that is a serious commitment. And because of that, I've decided to create a second podcast, and that one is going to be focused purely on topics related to distributed ledger technology, topics, cryptocurrency, stuff around that. We'll be interviewing people like we've done on the show already. People like Mance Harmon with Hashgraph, Malcolm with Wax, and a lot of the issues around that, because I think this is something that's going to be absolutely fascinating to watch it unroll before our eyes and potentially get into some of these things before others and benefit from that. And this whole podcast will be coming out soon, and I will announce it when it comes closer. I literally decided to do it this morning. So that's the way I am. I've just been thinking about it, boom, this morning, okay, I'm going to do it. That, of course, that whole thing is not going to affect Wealth Formula Podcast. Wealth Formula Podcast is really what I consider bread and butter. This is where we learn how to create real wealth. Admittedly, the whole crypto thing is highly speculative. I've talked about this before. I consider it an asymmetric risk. But those kinds of things are kind of fun too. So, but Wealth Formula Podcast is bread and butter. This is what we need to do. If you're not interested in any sort of speculation or asymmetric risk or whatever, this is the place where we are going to continue really focusing on topics of wealth creation, the old-fashioned way, by investing in real assets and cash flow and all that fun stuff as well. And we're going to get into more depth on stuff like that as the year progresses, with different types of things and education products as well. So Anyway, I think this whole thing, this new podcast, will be fun for those of you who like my style of teaching and interviewing, who really want to get deeper into the crypto world. Because right now, there's not a lot of really good podcasts in that world. I hate to say it, but most of them are kind of silly. But this I think is, I'm looking at this as seriously as I do Wealth Formula, in terms of the tone and tenor of it. And I don't want a bunch of BS on there. So anyway, that's my big announcement. One favor I have for you is, if you have any good ideas for a podcast name, let me know. I'm kind of racking my brain right now trying to figure out something that's catchy, but not too silly, because of course I'm going to reach out to a lot of people to talk, and I don't want to be like, hey, I want to you want to be on this crazy name show, whatever, and they won't take me seriously. But you know how it goes. So that's it for me on Wealth Formula Podcast this week. This is Buck Joffrey signing off.